And when I got home, I looked at my parents and I said, I am never, ever going into that Catholic church again or any other Catholic church because there are so many hypocrites in that church. And my mother, who's from Ireland, looked at me and she says, Michael, there's always room for one more. Now, this was not what I wanted to hear, right? But nonetheless, she was absolutely right. And it caused me to dawn, a friend of mine who's Greek Orthodox once told me that when you think of sin, the first thing you should think about is yourself. Father Catamalesa, who's the papal household preacher, once said that hypocrisy is one of the most widespread of all sins, but it's the least confessed. And there is a sense that, not just for teenagers like myself, but it's a kind of occupational hazard. That for many of us, we think we are often better than we are, and we sometimes even think that our institutions are better than we are. And so a friend of Ken Goodpastor, who could only stay here for a day because his daughter was married and he had family, he just came here, has a wonderful phrase that I've always found very helpful, and it's this: let's make friends with hypocrisy. Certainly on a personal basis, it's an important thing, not so much that we celebrate our failings, but simply, instead of trying to rationalize our way out of them, to, in a sense, recognize them, accept them. And not only on a personal basis, but it also seems to me that it's an important thing for us to do that institutionally. That we need to make friends with hypocrisy in terms of the institutions in which we find ourselves in. I know many of you have been to London and been to the Tube, and you know when you go to the Tube, there's that constant voice that says, mind the gap, mind the gap, mind the gap. Our institutions, it seems to me, are in a sense, have a hard time with making friends with hypocrisy because often we fall into a default setting. Don Brill in his talk mentioned that there is a kind of institutional weight of university proceduralism that can take a life of its own and fail to seriously consider the importance and depth of the mission and identity of the institution. This kind of default setting modes fall into the paths of least resistance, conflict avoidance, bureaucratic procedures and processes, rationalizations, as well as a kind of incentive and reward system that can marginalize the mission, all of which puts us on a road where we begin to fail to ask, what's the destination? This default setting mode that we can fall into, often within our institutions, makes us more and more selective about what we see and more narrow about what we measure to be the value of what we're doing. Our default settings in our institutions are in danger of moving us away from the ecclesial community out of which our university started, and then from the philosophical and theological vision that they have, and also from the social principles that could have the capacity to guide business. So we need to make friends with hypocrisy, we need humility, as we kind of move forward for this project. And that includes, obviously, all of us. Not just our institutions, but also on a personal basis. So I'd like to frame the rest of my comments according to the structure that John Fontana and Bob Bees talked about in their paper, and what the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace document on the vocation of the business leader, which is to, what do we see, how do we judge, and what kind of actions are we going to do? Seeing, judging, and acting. So first, seeing. How do we see our specific situations and circumstances and the multiple challenges and opportunities that we in Catholic universities find ourselves in? I find my former colleague, Peter Vail, he had a metaphor which I found very helpful, and he called it permanent whitewater. And it seems to me that's an apt description of our situation. We are in permanent whitewater. We find ourselves in a complex set of currents whose variables are rapidly swirling that make them very difficult to predict even in the short term. The challenge is, can we recognize this complexity and this precarious nature of our situation and not reduce it to simple formulas or programs, and to begin to discern the patterns, the connections, the causal relationships, while keeping the whole in mind, but also working on particular parts. It is indeed a difficult challenge for our universities. There are many challenges, but let me highlight 3 of them, which have been talked about at this conference. The first one is economic. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the so-called business model of higher education is broken. Has the high cost of a degree and its low value in the marketplace combined to such an extent that students will start to seek alternatives to our institutions? The increasing debt of our students and their parents from university education and their ability for the students to find careers to pay back that debt is, as many people are pointing out, risking a so-called educational bubble. Can we continue to rely on ever-increasing tuition, more endowment income, continued levels of state-sponsored financial aid, all wrapped up in very expensive student unions, luxurious recreation facilities with large supporting staffs? We no doubt have serious issues on the economic front. And the economics of higher education is thus putting pressures on the delivery of higher education. How can technology lower university costs to provide higher education and increase its value to the marketplace without becoming a commodity? We are all facing increasing online options that reduce the cost of delivery of higher education, but may be seemingly to be driving what Darrell Kane called in one of her sessions, moving from a transformational model of education to simply an informational model. Obviously, finding hybrids and creating ways to deliver education will be significant for our future. Along with these technological and economic challenges are cultural ones, which I think may be the most challenging of all. Within an increasing pluralistic and secular world, how does Catholic universities maintain and deepen their religious and moral center while engaging and contributing to the culture? How can the Catholic university as the tradition often puts it, be in the world but not of it? One expression of this difficulty was expressed by Father Heft in his talk when he said, "I think it is important to realize at the outset how difficult it is to get an adequate grasp of the religious mission of a Catholic university in intellectual terms that appropriate the disciplines that we find ourselves in." In terms of business education, several things can be mentioned here. One is, many of you said, that business faculty tend not to be opposed or hostile to the mission of the universities. Actually, for the most part, they tend to be far more open than those in the humanities. But, as Jean Lansniak pointed out in his comments to Don Brill and Jim Heft's paper, that sometimes the openness leads itself to a compartmentalization, and that it is simply marginalized even though there's not a hostility to it. These economic, technological, and cultural challenges and opportunities, as well as many others, will play an important part of our future. To what extent and how it will be difficult to foresee. For some of us, we may be overly pessimistic and fail to see the opportunities that will emerge from these challenges. For others, we may be naively optimistic in the threats they hold. The value of our conferences, I hope, is that by removing ourselves from the day-to-day routine of our own institutions and coming together with others and putting ourselves in a receptive mode, we can see the world in a much better way than we did before we came here. So seeing. Second point, judging. What we see in higher education today and its complexities will take on different expressions in each institution that we find ourselves in. Yet, if we don't have a clear North Star to guide us, we will find ourselves lost in the winds of change. As the book of Proverbs tells us, without a vision, the people will perish. Carlos Howell stated in his paper, without an intellectual idea, a substantive intellectual idea, the university is left without a north, and hence is unable to fulfill its role in guidance of society. So what are the criteria of judgment that are distinctively Catholic? I realize this can take on multiple expressions, but if we cannot point to distinctive claims that are uniquely and distinctively Catholic and that have a deep theological root system, we will find ourselves with cut flowers, which may for a while look healthy and vibrant, but will nonetheless fail to rejuvenate themselves since they no longer have a root system to keep them growing. I see 3 elements of a Catholic tradition that provide this criteria of judgment that's been talked about throughout this seminar. The first, the Catholic intellectual tradition. At the heart of this tradition are 2 major convictions for a Catholic university. The first, again, which has been talked about, the unity of knowledge. An important conviction of Catholic universities is the belief that the world makes sense because the world has an order and a unity to it. And speaking about the situation in the U.S., particularly in the academy in the U.S., Alistair McIntyre says the following. He says, "What the Catholic faith confronts today in American higher education, and indeed in American education more generally, is not primarily some range of alternative beliefs about the order of things, but rather a belief that there is no such order of things, of which there could be a unified, if complex, understanding, or even a movement toward such an understanding. A Catholic university seeks to cultivate the intellect to see this unity, to see things whole." John Henry Newman used the metaphor of a curriculum as a circle of knowledge, in which all disciplines depend on a certain mutual correction and completion, in which the absence of any discipline weakens all the disciplines. The unity of knowledge reminds us that each discipline is not an isolated set of facts, leading only to more specialized explorations. An implication of this unity of knowledge for Catholic universities must be that it is interdisciplinary, and an important expression of this interdisciplinary character is that it integrates the liberal and business education. One of the concerns of Warren Bennis and James O'Toole in a very oft-cited article in the Harvard Business Review is that business disciplines are increasingly isolating themselves from the liberal arts disciplines, no longer drawing on these disciplines to see what business is and what it ought to be. The university, this unity of knowledge, is to enlarge the mind and to have the capacity to connect disciplines with each other, to provide a more holistic view of the world. The second conviction of a Catholic university, particularly from the Catholic intellectual tradition, is the dialogue and complementarity of faith and reason. As Ex Corde Exclese explains, the Catholic university has a privileged task like no other, and it is to unite existentially by intellectual effort two orders of reality that too frequently tend to be placed in opposition as though they were antithetical. The search for truth, reason, and the certainty of already knowing the font of truth, faith. Within the Catholic intellectual tradition, faith enhances reason. It does not replace it. Grace perfects nature. It does not destroy it. Faith without reason tends towards superstition, fundamentalism, and fatalism. But reason without faith tends toward an inhuman efficiency, instrumentalism, and ultimately a lack of community. Both, without each other, can distort reality. These two claims, it seems to me, of a university, of a Catholic university education, is of critical importance. And I think they connect very well with something that C.S. Lewis said many years ago. He said, "The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but it is to irrigate deserts." I think I love that metaphor. It is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. Critical theory, postmodern analysis, the hermeneutics of suspicion, the relentless utilitarian calculations we provide ourselves, the empirical and quantitative research and measurements that we're all involved in, all of which provide important insights on the world, but all of which are always prone to a fixation that can drive wonder and ultimately love out of education and of the student. In our desire to be rigorous and legitimate, we can too often lose a vision of what a Catholic university can be. Without such claims as a unity of knowledge and the dialogue and the complementarity of faith and reason, we will be constantly prone to instrumentalize knowledge to a utilitarian vision, particularly within the realm of business. I do think the Catholic intellectual tradition is a very important area, and those two things are very important. We've also, the second area that I'd like to just briefly mention is the Catholic social tradition. We have talked about this throughout this seminar. I won't highlight too much of it, but certainly the idea of the vocation of business, all the social principles that we've been talking about, common good, human dignity, universal destination material goods, and many, many others are very important principles that give us different principles that you often find in business, and also the importance of the virtues. This tradition is a very important tradition, and it logically should be engaged in the area of business. The third area, which we've also talked about, but I, again, simply want to highlight, is the Catholic spiritual life. It seems to me that without prayer, without discernment, without worship, without the sacraments, without God's living presence in our lives, we simply are going to it will not happen. And so always to be mindful of the importance of prayer, the importance of worship, which can ground our work, which is the thing that can sustain it even when some of these things may look dire. So, judge. Third, act. So what do we do? Well, we're doing a lot of things. It's always wonderful to be at a conference like this to see the many things that are going on. The last session I was in, what Nikki Santos is doing in Santa Clara, what other people are doing at Sacred Heart, and many other different institutions. Lots of different models, lots of different things going on. But what I'd like to do is focus particularly on this area of institutionalization and the importance of this idea of institutionalization. And also to ask this question: what are the institutional levers we need to pull to change our institutions? I think that's an important question. What are the institutional levers that we need to pull? You also have heard the famous one, give me a place to stand on a lever and I will move the world, right? What are the levers that we need to move our institutions? And again, we've talked about these. It seems to me the critical one, first I would put forward, is the idea of a mission-driven hiring recruitment. This is of crucial importance, and we have to be far more creative. And Daryl Kane mentioned this in one of her sessions. In Ex Corde Ecclesia, it talks about fidelity and courageous creativity. Courageous creativity is absolutely necessary in the area of mission and hiring. If we do not change that, and we have to do it creatively as well as courageously, because there will certainly be resistance, but it has to be done creatively. Again, it's one of those things, if we do it well, in 10 years we'll find major changes going on. The second area, again, which has been talked about, Jim Heff talked about in his talk, of faculty development and formation. I know Bob Shoemake talked about the program we have and new faculty development, a new faculty orientation program we have at St. Thomas and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. Steve Porth, I think, is doing fantastic work at St. Joe's of these summer seminars of ethics across the curriculum. Again, very creative. And also many others. Andre Delbecq at Santa Clara has done this idea of the Ignatian form, of engaging, in a sense, people who've gotten tenured as new leaders. This type of formation of faculty is of critical importance. The third area is evaluation, reward, and promotion and tenure. We have major challenges here. Many of our institutions are increasingly buying into an academic excellence model, and that is forcing research and enforcing the reward structures into a place that will make it very difficult for the Catholic mission of the institution to maintain itself. And lastly, and we spent a lot of time on this in the seminar, is the curriculum and the research. At the heart of the university, the curriculum and the research of what we do. If we cannot find these ideas translated into the research that we're doing and into the curriculum that we're providing, again, we are in difficult issues. So I think those are some areas that we've talked about that are important to move an institution, the levers that can move an institution. Let me also highlight an action that's really dealing with this group. And let me just highlight some things that we'll be doing in the future concerning what we've done here. One is, let me announce to you that the 9th International Conference, the next one that we'll have on Catholic Social Thought and Business and Management Education, will be held in Manila, Philippines. At De La Salle University, even though the Christian Brothers beat me up years ago, I'll still go there and have a conference there. It will be our first Christian Brother Conference host institution. So Ben Tehanke, Ben, would you stand up? Ben will be our host. I was at the Philippines last August, and it's an extraordinary country. And it's also an extraordinary university, and they're taking things very seriously. And I must say, the Filipino people are probably the most friendly and hospitable people in the world. Not the one, I said one of them, right? But certainly it's a wonderful place. The description of this conference has not been quite designed yet, although certainly the questions of poverty, wealth distribution, social entrepreneurship. Obviously, I think the vocation of the business leader document might be an interesting place in which we can develop some of the ideas that go along with that. So that will be that conference, and we'll be looking for sponsors and organizers for that conference. So if you have any interest, we'd be very interested in hearing from you. The second thing is we will be putting up all the papers on the website. Along with all the respondents, we'll be contacting you on this. All the respondents, we'd like to have your responses, and we'll be putting that up on the website. And again, putting out an email to encourage people to do that. We get a lot of hits. A lot of people will do search engines and things of that sort as a way of getting connected to this work that we're doing. We will also, for those papers that were delivered, we will have a special issue of the Journal for Catholic Higher Education. And again, we'll be contacting you on that, but we'd like to have your papers submitted. It will be a referee process. We obviously cannot do all the papers in the special issue, but I think it will certainly give some visibility by having that special issue on that. And lastly, we're going to continue a curricular work that we've been doing. We met a couple of years ago in Portland, and we developed a curricular website that is trying to get more practical and specific about how do you incorporate the Catholic social tradition in such a way that it is recognizes the autonomy of your own disciplines and the integrity of your own disciplines. So it does not feel like it's being imposed upon it, but it actually can propose within it something that can maybe more deeply see these disciplines in a much larger picture. And so we'll be continuing to develop that website, and we'll also be putting that out for all of you.